Hi, okay, I think I'm going to start now. So, good evening and welcome to Christie's Education webinar, A Journey Through the Art of Africa and its Diaspora with Elikem Logan. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Joyce Chung, Program Manager at Christie's Education, and I will be your host this evening alongside our wonderful lecturer, Elikem. We are delighted to deliver this lecture to celebrate Black History Month here at Christie's. And if you're returning from our earlier session, we are so happy to have you back. Elikem Logan is a modern and contemporary art specialist with a focus on painting and sculpture from Africa and its diaspora. Having previously worked within the African Modern and Contemporary Department at Sotheby's, his research interests span the political, cultural, legal, and intellectual history of West Africa. He holds an MA in Art History and Management and an MLit in Legal and Constitutional Studies from the University of St. Andrews, as well as an MSc in African Studies from Oxford University. Elikem will be on hand to answer your questions on his lecture at the end, and the Q&A chat box will be open throughout. So please feel free to include your questions for him. Before I hand over to Elikem to begin today's session, please allow me to read the following notice. By registering for this event, you agree not to record the event in any way. All attendees will be muted and remain anonymous. There will be time for questions at the end of the event. However, please don't hesitate to submit questions in advance. This lecture is being recorded, and all registered participants will receive the recording shortly after the end of the webinar with a 2-week expiry date. So thank you very much for joining us. And if you're back from before, thank you very much for joining us again. And the floor is yours, Elikem.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining me on this webinar. It's a pleasure to be here. Before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. So I must say that everything herein is my own opinion, an expression of my own ideas. I admittedly will miss a lot of incredible artwork and artists in the discussion. It's decidedly sort of Afrocentric presentation as well. If anything, maybe even West African or Ghanaian. And so any moments or areas that I miss in the conversation are for you to carry on with research in your own time, or if you have any specific questions, please feel free to ask me at the end. With that, I will delve into the lecture. So first things first, I want to set the scene for you a little bit. Over the course of this presentation, I will lay down the idea of a problem for art historians of Black art. And the problem, as I perceive it, is specifically art historical and not necessarily artistic, because the science or the practice of art history necessarily concerns categorization, taxonomy. And so if we are to think of and make sense of artists' work in relation to each other and in relation to the wider sort of narrative traditions that the artwork itself creates within this wider body of the discipline, then what are we to make of Black art, of Black artists, artists from Africa, artists from the African diaspora, artists of African heritage? And where are we to place them in the tradition of art history generally? This is the problem that I want to set for you. And over the course of the lecture, I will begin by explaining that problem in detail as it pertains to art history specifically. And then I will go on to sharing a few examples of artists in Africa and across the diaspora and the ways in which they have been aware of and reactive to, some even circumventing this problem that I lay before you, in their varying ways. So, I mean, I will begin briefly by just mentioning the work that I have here. Um, so this is a work by Ghanaian artist Alan Atsui, Fresh and Fading Memories. It was produced in 2007 for the occasion of the Central Pavilion of the Venice Biennale, which, according to many, is sort of described as the Olympics of Art. That's because it's the only art festival where individual countries present pavilions and, in a sense, compete with one another. Elan Atsui at this stage was part of the Venice Biennale, even though Ghana, the country from which he hails, had not yet featured in a pavilion at all under any context. the work itself is a reflection of the sort of most salient parts of his practice. These bottle cap tapestries, which are sort of sewn together through the labor of the various people in his studio who smash bottle caps, literally bottle caps from discarded alcohol and sort of other general purpose consumer goods. They are flattened, stitched together to make these tapestries, and then these gleaming tapestries, as seen from afar, represent almost chainmail um or in in a sense kente cloth, which is this Ghanaian heritage textile. I put this work here because it encapsulates the problem for me. On one hand, I think the work is activated by its presence in Venice, right? This old crumbling Venetian facade, Venice itself being this old vestige of empire. At one point, this huge trading post, which defined that European spirit of trade and enterprise. But at this point now, sort of within the context of the EU and Italy as sort of um from an imperial perspective being past its days, this work touches upon that history, but at the same time brings a decidedly Africanist, a decidedly Ghanaian sort of visual culture, and imposes that upon this facade. And so for me, the reason that it encapsulates this problem is because if we are to shed the Venetian sort of connotations and interpretations which come from this artwork being juxtaposed in this place, we lose something in the nature of the meaning of this artwork. But at the same time, if we are to see this work as a purely European work and not necessarily an African one, we also lose a great deal of the sort of visual culture which is imbued within the work. And so that I think it will give you a sense of the kind of dynamic problems that are raised by virtue of this entanglement of Africa and blackness within the Western art historical canon. But if I may zoom out for a second as we begin, I want to talk about the construction of blackness in society. Blackness as being construed as socially, culturally backwards, right? And I trace this, especially in sort of popular culture, to a text produced in 1899 or published in 1899 by an author named Joseph Conrad called Heart of Darkness. I'm sure many people would have come across this. I think for a while it was sort of part of the English GCSE curriculum. Anyways, just Joseph Conrad writes Heart of Darkness. It's a fictional, sort of pseudo-fictional novel about an adventure into the heart of Africa, in this case, Congo. It depicts, for the purpose of this lecture, I won't go into all of the details, but it it basically captures the spirit of adventure, which is so central to the European colonialist project. And it does this in this sort of glamorizing manner. At the same time, there is a thinly veiled critique of the idea of empire and colonization, of the idea of conquering a land and taking it over, the sort of hubris that's involved in that project. Um, that being said, this book, for many amongst the West, crystallizes the notion of Africa as the dark continent, a mysterious place with mysterious people who are backwards, and don't necessarily have an awareness of the sort of heights of European enlightenment that have been achieved outside of the continent of Africa, right? And this is essential, in my view, to framing the conversation about the sort of problems that artists face from an intellectual point of view and sort of categorizing their work, right? I think from this moment on, we start to see the sort of erosion or alienation of blackness from the idea of cultural sophistication or intellectual sophistication, blackness as backwardness. And that conflation, I argue, is central to understanding the sort of pitfalls that artists can feel that their works are vulnerable to interpretation, um, interpretation under. I place another seminal text here, The Voice of Africa, Leo Frobenius, and I think it's important because what Joseph Conrad does in popular culture, I think Leo Frobenius's text is representative of what is going on in the academic sphere, right? So Frobenius was an archaeologist, he was an ethnographer, he was part of the wave of scholars who were within this tradition, this fledgling tradition at the time of ethnography, which basically studied human cultures, right? But it did that with this implicit idea of backwardness baked into it, right? This idea that The West, having progressed so far down its cultural terrain, is looking back to Africa or looking back to several other cultures which are much more backwards and attempting to make sense of them in order to make more sense of the origins from which culture, Western culture has derived. So there's this deterministic idea that there is a line of culture with Africa further back than the West. And so if the West wants to know about how it was, centuries ago, all it must do is study Africa. Bear in mind these two things. So Leo Frobenius has his first expedition to Africa in 1905, and his first archaeological finds are then Joseph Conrad is published 1899, Heart of Darkness, and these two texts are right at the turn of the 20th century, and coincide quite neatly with the explosion of the colonialist project. The Scramble for Africa, as it's called, it begins in 1884, and by the early 20th century, almost every single country in Africa and the vast majority of its landmass has been conquered by European powers. And so, taking that as foregrounding the argument, we can really see that culturally there is this crystallization of blackness as backwardness, which forms in some part a justification for the colonialist project, right? It's called in many ways the civilizing mission. At the other side, the flip side of this also, in the artistic realm, there is a real distillation of this idea of backwardness, and specifically in the realm of culture, of art. But I mean, I include this slide here just to push back against that narrative, because I want to show that, some may push back to me, or some may offer a sort of criticism of the argument that I said here, to say Heart of Darkness couldn't have been the start of this. These ex-colonialist expeditions could not have been the origin of these projects. These things are much longer phenomena. And I don't want to claim that, racism, backwardness, othering, is something that begins in the 20th century. That being said, I want to show that it's very much a construction, and it's a social construction that is done through a consistent promulgation of ideas which lay down this idea of backwardness. It did not emerge simply from nowhere, and it's not an idea that came from time immemorial. And these works, I think, help aid this idea that or this argument that I'm laying down for you. So I'll begin from right to left. The work on the very right is by an artist named, well, it's by a studio of Jasper or Geronimus Becks. They were brothers producing work together, so it's not exactly clear who produced the work finally. This is a portrait of an emissary, Don Miguel de Castro, who was an ambassador for the King of Congo in the 17th century. And this portrait is one of five, I believe, that the ambassador commissioned directly from the artist studios. Other portraits were those of his servants, and then he had two portraits, apparently him in traditional Western dress and him in traditional African dress. I say this because art historically, this work possesses all of the pictorial devices which are afforded to European noblemen at the same time, concurrently with the production of this work. So this is not a retrospective, a sort of retrospective uplifting of the black figure with the hindsight of sort of a racial reckoning. This is in 1643, produced by Europeans on Africa, commissioned directly from the artist. And we can see that, he's depicted as a European nobleman on equal terms, even with the most advanced pictorial devices of the day. No, I note his gaze. Notice that the eyes of the sitter, they betrayed this pictorial device we call the courtier's gaze. It was developed by Raphael, who's this famed, Renaissance painter. The figure looks at you and through you and beyond you, and it gives this semblance of grandeur, which evokes a sense of reverence for the figures, right? And that has been given to Don Miguel de Castro. So it goes to show that, and bear in mind, I should say at this time, 1643, the black population in Lisbon, which is at this point the dominant sailing power in the world, is 10%. So there are 10% of the people in Lisbon are black, right? There is no racism to be spoken of in any way equivalent to that which ensues the decades after, with the coming of the transatlantic and slave trade and colonial slavery and the industrialization of that process and colonialism itself. Right. So we're in a very different time. And it's just to show you that this is a construction. Of course, also in the realm of art history, Africans, I mean, I'll just take one example of Nigeria. We're looking here at two works from the Nok, sort of the Nok, which are a pre-colonial polity, believed, between the sort of 15th century BC to first century BC, and the Ifa, who are the part of the European tradition. So both traditions are within one country or a sort of one modern context now and span the entire breadth between naturalism and abstraction, almost in the reverse to the way in which it was explored in the West. So again, this idea of cultural backwardness is disproved absolutely by the historical record, and goes to show that in order for that idea to have taken hold, it was a cultural construction. Now, what are the implications of having such a construction for us as art historians? As I mentioned before, the job of an art historian is primarily categorization. It's a taxonomic issue, placing things into their category so that we can better make sense of individual artworks by virtue of these sort of frameworks that we've created. And there is no better example of that, especially when we're talking about the African example, than Alfred Barr's hand-drawn charts. Well, there's a sort of finished version of the chart. I believe it's in MoMA's collection. But this is produced by Alfred Barr, who was the director of the Museum of Modern Art, I believe at its inception. Um, and the exhibition, the occasion for which he produced this object was Cubism and Abstract Art, a landmark exhibition. It was the exhibition which laid down the idea of modern European artists appropriating the visual culture of pre-colonial Africa and various other parts of the world. I should mention, Japan, um, Mesopotamia, the Southeast Asia, appropriating the visual culture of these places, which have been brought to them via the ethnographic projects, which have recorded their histories and in some cases looted the objects to bring them back. Um, it's about the appropriation of that, and this exhibition basically lays down these artists as modernists for, in many ways, their appropriation and redevelopment of these aesthetic themes into a tradition that is recognizable by the Western art historical canon, right? And we see here, and Alfred Barr is attempting to make sense of the progression from a sort of impressionist and sort of proto-abstract Western tradition all the way through to the Cubism and what we understand as this sort of real modernist artistic tradition into the sort of into the interwar and post-war surrealism, Dadaism that they morph into. Now, what is most important for us in this lecture is the box in the middle, in the middle of the entire graph here. It's entitled Negro Sculpture, right? And this, for me, encapsulates the problem perfectly, right? Because it flattens all of that visual richness. I mean, if I take you right back here, and I show you these two objects here, this mask, this head, this Nok terracotta head, and this brass ether naturalist head, these two objects, as contrasted with each other, are all flattened into one category, known only as Negro sculpture. Not to speak of the wall mural painting traditions, not to speak of the weaving and textile traditions, which are so important to African visual culture. They've been flattened into one category known as Negro sculpture. And though that in itself is a feeder, right? Notice in pencil and not in pen. It's a feeder category into Fauvism, Cubism, into the various other movements that come in. Now, why is this important and how does this constitute a problem? I think it's important because essentially it creates a double alienation for the black artists making work post 1936, right? And bear in mind, in 1936, African countries are still colonized. So many of the artists working, even though they may have been aware of this exhibition, would have been doing so under colonialist context, under colonial schools, with countries that aren't even necessarily theirs, right? They would have British passports, French passports, Portuguese passports. I know it's hard to imagine, but these people were citizens of European countries in Africa, right? America, obviously, we know what's going on there with segregation at the time. So artists, even black artists, aren't necessarily even liberated or in a position to make art which responds to this. But if you were to imagine a black artist coming to the fray then with this as the sort of prevailing narrative about what constitutes art from your indigenous base, right? It creates an alienation where on one side, the art that is seen as African, right? That is seen as indigenous to you, which which you are not appropriating from, and is sort of your natural base of origin where you would start your artistic exploration. That has been understood as backwards and resulting from a backwards people in such a way that it's alienated from the idea of Western sophistication, right? Of intellectual or cultural sophistication. It's coming from a place that's further down in this timeline of human development, right? So if you're an artist, immediately, if you adopt these as your central tropes from your context, from which your tradition, your lineage, from which you draw art historical importance, you immediately sort of limit the scope of your practice, right? And then on the other hand, you're also alienated from this sort of idea of your tradition, of you being able to take your tradition and move it forward, right? Or bringing your tradition and bringing it into the modern world. Why? Because your work, in many ways, the visual aspects of your work have been appropriated and translated into the modernist arena already by artists who aren't necessarily from Africa, right? I mean, I'm talking about Matisse, I'm talking about Picasso, I'm talking about Georges Braque, I'm talking about Paul Gauguin. These are all artists that we know, and adopting them, taking these themes, translating them into the modernist arena means that that job has essentially been done. And so African artists who seek to do, or black artists in general, who seek to perform this same gesture are now seen as derivative, right? And the African culture, which is their base, is also seen as primitive, right? So it's a for me, I see this as an art historian thinking about how to make sense of these two of a black artist's work. I see it as sitting within these two, right? And artists being aware of these problems. How do I escape, on one hand, my work being seen as primitive, on the other hand, my work being seen as derivative of Western projects already? And that is essentially the problem which I want to put forward to you as the central problem of belonging for black artists in art history. Over the course of the rest of the lecture, I will seek to show you some examples, both on the continent and outside the continent, of artists' approaches to circumvent this problem, challenge this problem, move against or move around it, right? Um, I begin with perhaps the most storied of visual and national traditions art historically of any on the continent. Again, I'm biased because I'm West African. So Senegal, and I think Senegal is a very interesting example because in many ways I mean, politically, culturally, but also definitely in the realm of art, in many ways they embrace the culture of the outgoing colonial administration, which for in many ways has shaped their sort of national landscape pre-independence. So Senegal becomes independent in the decade of African independence, or the decade of Africa, circa 1960. When they're independent from colonial rule, their first president, Aimé Césaire, is a poet. And he does this really brazen bit of policy where he takes 25% of the national budget of Senegal in his first year of being a country and dedicates that to arts and culture entirely. That's an unprecedented move. It's not been done by any government anywhere. It will not be done anytime soon by any government anywhere. But this goes to show the involvement of the artist, or the involvement of Aimé Césaire, sorry, it's not Aimé Césaire. My apologies. The first president was Leopold Senghor. Aimé Césaire was his good friend and fellow poet, who and the two of them together came up with the concept of negritude. Negritude is this idea which amongst black intellectuals in Paris, this idea that in order to combat this idea, to combat the notions of inferiority associated with blackness, they would create a cultural movement which actually emphasized and highlighted the contributions of Black civilization to global civilization, to say actually we're not further back in that line of development, because without us you wouldn't be considered here at this forefront at the precipice of modernity, right? So Leopold Senghor, Aimé Césaire, they developed this idea of negritude, and negritude is the foundational sort of philosophy for Senegal's sort of post-colonial artistic development, right? And I use an example here of a work by a pioneering artist named Papa Ibra Tall, to make this point to you. So Papa Ibra Tall was just like Leopold Senghor, just like Aimé Césaire, um, uh, an artist existing in the sort of late colonial, post-colonial time, who trained in Paris, lived in Paris, assimilated to the sort of Western Academy via the Parisian academic conventions, and then slowly begin to develop this anti-colonial sentiment in line with his sort of post-colonial liberati, or his traveled liberati that were literati that were present in Paris. At the time of independence, he moves back to Senegal like so many other sort of important post-colonialists. And he is a foundational artist, one of the founding artists for what we term the École de Dakar. École de Dakar, the School of Dakar, it simply refers to a group of artists who are the sort of they together comprise the foundation of the Senegalese artistic tradition. The École de Dakar has this dual role because it also serves as an institution. There is the École des Beaux-Arts, very much like the French École des Beaux-Arts, set up to mimic um, the sort of structure of the artistic landscape and the artistic infrastructure in the West, in Paris. And the École de Dakar produces many of Senegal's most storied artists, even to this day. Um, but Papa Iberto, he had a love of tapestry, and he produced some of the most stunning works of the most stunning tapestry works and the most iconic works, works that in our sense, we will deem as part of the sort of African canon. This work here is called, translates to, I won't attempt the French, it translates to the Star Sower. And again, it speaks to this idea that the artist is tapping into the very visual and cultural themes which are associated with Africa, and attempting to reappropriate them in a manner which shows Africa in the best light, right? So he's taking from, in my estimation, motifs from ancient Egypt, motifs from pre-colonial sculpture, which has proliferated amongst West Africa, the flora and fauna of Africa, and this general idea of Africa as being in touch with a certain kind of spiritual mysticism. And he's taking that philosophy and that idea, and he's reappropriating that in many ways, taking ownership of that, and he's making that beautiful, right? And this is very much in line with the sort of Senegalese post-colonial project. It's the idea that we are very much in tandem with our sort of pre-colonial, Senegal was very closely entangled with its French sort of colonial father, just like many other Francophone African countries were. In many ways, they didn't have a choice. We can have that discussion another time. But because of that entanglement, it called for a sort of acceptance of the fact that you will always have to exist within the Western tradition, and then an attempt to sort of reappropriate or change the definition of blackness to suit to create an implication, or to create a semblance of Africanness that Africans themselves could live with, even though they were within the black the Western cultural tradition. I don't know if that made too much sense. It's confusing me myself, but basically the way that you should see it is the Senegalese uh were assimilated in many ways to the Western Academy in order to change the definition of blackness within the Western Academy. So it was a very decidedly assimilationist approach. By contrast, we have Ghana. Again, I'll betray my biases right at the door. I'm Ghanaian, so if I have a better presentation of Ghana than any other country, you'll understand why. But Ghana had a completely different approach. I mean, we could talk about it in relation to colonial systems, right? So Ghana was a former British colony, Senegal, a former French colony. Um, Ghana was ruled according to the indirect rule system. France was ruled according to the direct system. What is the implication of that? France was basically had a very hands-on approach to the administration of their colonies, such that all administrators or decision makers at every key level were French or reported directly to France and had their loyalty exclusively with that of France. Whereas the British had, and this is very loosely speaking, an indirect rule system which empowered indigenous actors to be decision makers and prioritized an idea of self-reliance. Um, and so in many ways, the seeds for the sort of cultural reconstruction post-colonialization were laid by this sort of colonial system, the decisions by the colonial leaders on how they were going to administrate their colonies. And we can see the echoes of that here. I mean, France being so hands-on with the development of Senegalese culture directly ties in with sort of the Senegalese post-colonial academy looking almost exactly like the French academy in the artistic realm. In Ghana, there was an emphasis placed on art being in service to the general post-colonial nationalistic mission. And so in Ghana, what you saw was a discernibly much more propagandistic art and as and also a much less well-formed structure to the art world because there wasn't a blueprint like a colonial Western system, which any Ghanaians thought was fit to sort of wholesale transplant into the Ghanaian environment. And so we see the work that I've shown you here to sort of encapsulate this is a work by an artist named Kofi Antubam, a very interesting artist because this is an artist that was trained under the Colonial Academy. So he went to the College of Painting and Sculpture, which then became the University of Ghana's Department of Painting and Sculpture. Very much came through a British education system which had been created in Ghana and then was trained briefly in England before he returned to Ghana to be to be appointed the sort of state artist by our first president, who was Kwame Nkrumah. He was the first president of Ghana, and Ghana was the first country to be independent from colonial rule in sub-Saharan Africa. That's important because Ghana's had this outsized mantle to represent Africa and represent the cause for African liberation. Because at the time that Ghana was independent, no other countries in Black Africa were. So as a result, Kofi Antubam had an equally outsized role in laying down an artistic framework and laying down individual artworks, which really represented and disseminated this idea of Ghana's sort of post-colonial struggle to actually liberate all the other countries, right? And so the work here, let me show you the ways in which this work kind of does that. So this is a work called An Akan Ohima at Lunch. Ohima is just a name for queen or queen mother. In Akan culture, so Akan is a pre-colonial sort of polity, which used to be an empire, is now sort of proto-state within the area that's Ghana. The Akan people actually comprise a much larger area that's sort of larger than the area of Ghana now into the Ivory Coast and what have you. But the main group within the Akan is the Ashanti, and they are a sort of organized proto-state. Now, an Akan Ohima in this instance would be the head of state, right? So the Ohima is not, we have a matrilineal society, unlike the West, where the queen mother is the head of state who chooses the king upon any king's death. And it doesn't need to be a kingship line established for sort of succession. And so what we are seeing here is the typical, a sort of a typical scene of an Akan Ohima at lunch, dining with her servants. We have a depiction of the sort of Akan architecture. And this is obviously a scene that has been imagined. You can imagine that at the time, 1945, we're at the end of World War II. The British have very sort of thoroughly sort of asserted their power over the area that is Ghana. And life in this rural traditional style scarcely exists exclusively in that manner. And so what Kofi Antibam is doing, he is almost re-educating the entire populace of Ghana about what our pre-colonial and our indigenous traditions are in light of this post-colonial struggle, right? This idea that we must return to our roots and we must remember what our culture, our indigenous culture is. And that in itself, an embracing of that is radical because it's necessarily involves sort of removing all the colonial entanglements which you necessarily have at the moment, right? So this is an anti-colonial picture, it's a propagandistic picture, but at the same time, it's sort of history painting, right? In a way that we would think about sort of a king at his courts in sort of Western academic portraiture or Western history painting in the same light. So in a sense, there is an assimilationist wave here, but it's not overt, right? It's not the intention. The intention is actually to be radical. The intention is to be propagandistic. The intention is to be Ghana first. The intention is to be Africa or blackness first. It is not to create an artistic body of work which is seen by the West as equivalent. It's about asserting equivalence in order to gain liberation, right? Now, I include this symbol here because Ghana is a very interesting example where the visual culture, the indigenous visual culture, formed in a very important constituent part of the national artistic tradition. This Adinkra symbol, so Ghana has a system of symbols, and that's mainly from the Akan people. It is believed to have started in an area that's now in Ivory Coast. But these symbols have different philosophies, meanings, maxims, the different semiotic sort of codes, and they're different codes for life, and they represent different things. At the turn of independence, one symbol was sort of selected amongst the others as a representative of Africa's of the sort of post-colonial struggle and a sort of philosophy for making sense of post-colonial change, and that's called Sankofa. So Sankofa translates to go back and get it, to go back and return. This idea that in order to create a modern post-colonial culture in Ghana, the key was to return to indigenous roots, and I think that shows very clearly the sort of philosophical ends and aims of the people at the time. Um, Moving on very swiftly
Hi,
to
Elikem.
hi,
So
sorry.
about 15 minutes left, just to let you know.
Okay. I didn't
If
know
you
we
want
were
to
so pressed for
finish.
time. So, okay, I mean, I've presented these former countries, Senegal and Ghana, as examples of these sort of nationalistic top-down missions. I give you Nigeria as a very quick sort of counterpoint to show you that, it is very difficult to paint these movements with one brush and to talk about them in sort of holistic terms. All of those narratives are complicated. In Nigeria is in the country that we can really say without a doubt is the most complicated, or at least represents that level of complexity in a manner that is very easy to discern, right? Nigeria has Nigeria is obviously Africa's most populous country and it has a absolute gigantic amounts of different ethnic groups and different language groups. And that is reflected also in its cultural scene. There are a variety of approaches to this sort of decolonial, this sort of cultural problem that is presented for Black artists, and Nigerian artists approach them a bunch of ways. The artist here that I have is Benin Wonwu. Benin Wonwu, first Black artist to depict Queen Elizabeth II, was active in London, named by Drum Magazine as Africa's finest artist, kept a studio in London and in Onitsha, where he's from. There is uh this idea of the superstar artist emerges with an artist like Benin Wonwu. But Benin Wonwu is one example of an approach which was in many ways both kind of Senegalese and Ghanaian, if I may say, if I might, describe them in that manner. It was assimilationist in the sense that it took these notions of backwards Africanness, of the noble savage, and attempted to sort of elevate them and bring them forward into the new realm. But it was also nationalistic. It took specific codes or specific Nigerian culture and sought to bring them again into this realm of art making. And so in doing those things, Benamowu is really has a unique approach to this problem. There are other artists who take a variety of different approaches. Nigeria has some decidedly indigenous approaches, especially with Igbo artists, and they also have some more assimilationist approaches. But and one was the example that I chose to put forward to you. Nigeria is the subject of a really amazing Nigerian modernism exhibition at the Tate, and it does a better job than me at laying down this with a level of granular detail, which is really impressive. So I implore you to check that out. A special mention very quickly to photography, because photography has this really important role as being this carrier of or representative of technological progress, as well as being this artistic sort of medium. So on one level, people talk about the first images were produced in 1884 in Paris. It's called the daguerreotype. That's a certain type of photography that was produced. And once that was produced, almost immediately it was sent to the continent to document Africans, to disseminate information and images, to confirm this idea of Africa as this backwards continent. And so photography and the continent have always had a very close-knit relationship. And photography's relationship to art as being this sort of marker of a modernist period, because it takes away this idea of a functionality, right? When you have photography, you have no need to do portraits because people can sort of can just take an instant snapshot rather than pose hours for portrait. It has a very similar sort of effect in the on the continent, not necessarily art historically, but in terms of producing a sort of social revolution, right? So in Africa, we see in the emergence of sort of African studios where we see for the first time non-elites, so everyday people choosing to reflect themselves, choosing to dress themselves in ways that are aware of the West, in ways that are globally minded, in ways that are reminiscent or reactive to pop culture globally, not just in Africa. And that's where we get a real sense, again, in the art historical canon of Africans as slowly, subtly, and not necessarily radically circumventing or questioning that narrative of backwardness, but doing so simply by virtue of existing. There is no overt gesture to challenge, right? So it's a really important sort of approach implicitly. Um, Moving very quickly on, I want to touch very briefly on the different approaches, both in the different pockets of the diaspora to this same problem, because I think it's really important to show the sort of contrast between an African populace who are geographically alienated from the West and the diaspora who are part of the West but are intellectually, ideologically alienated from Western culture. Right. In Europe, I think is the best example of this, especially the UK. I've chosen this work by Sonia Boyce, lay back, keep quiet, and think of what made Britain so great. And I think this is a great example of showing you how, where in the African example, we have a very much project concerned with taking African themes or taking the notion of blackness and lifting it up. We have here a practice that is much more focused on problematizing whiteness, problematizing that Eurocentric spirit of adventure, which led to the colonialist or undergirded the colonialist project, right? So that it's still seeking to achieve the same aims. It's still trying to fight against this problem of identifying blackness within this very thin box of Negro sculpture. But it's doing that by attacking everything else, right? Of going for whiteness and Eurocentrism rather than from this other African perspective. And we can see here, I mean, Sonia Boyce, obviously, a British resident, has lived here for years, taking these motifs, which are showing different parts of the British Empire. If you ever are, on your way getting towards Buckingham Palace, you can see several monuments which mention different parts of empire. They're very sort of, they don't even really have any sense of coherence. You'll see, India here, Africa, a whole continent here, and then you'll have like individual countries. It's not really something that it's not about all the continents, right? So there is this sort of this sense of arbitrarily valuing different pockets of empire because of their sort of their central concerns or their needs for furnishing your empire because of the ways in which they help your colonialist project, right? And Sonia is sort of referencing this here with Cape Colony, India, Australia, whole continents, countries, that sort of callous nature. But on the fourth panel, she puts a depiction of herself. Now, to me, I read that as her sort of saying it's standing in, instead of Africa being on the fourth panel here within the cross, she puts her face there almost to show Africa, firstly, is much more complicated than the land to be conquered, that I am the result of this conquering of Africa, that someone who's black, has Caribbean heritage, has African heritage, and lives within the West is a perfect example of the implications of that colonialist project. So kind of problematizing the idea of valorizing conquest, right? By sort of putting herself there very radically and saying it's me. At the same time, on the other hand, we have, well, actually, I will unfortunately have to skip over this, but other notable examples, amazing artists like Lubena Himid, Chris Ofili, who have a more utopic approach to their practice, dreaming rather than addressing history, dreaming of worlds in which whiteness has not necessarily imposed itself onto blackness, or colonialism has not necessarily existed, dreaming of worlds where blackness exists in its own sort of utopic space with certain freedoms. So that's a way of sort of speculation, creating alternative histories, are ways of circumventing these sort of issues. Now across the pond, to across the Atlantic, we're looking at artists like Kehinde Wiley, who took very sort of, again, these sort of challenging, this approach to challenge the West rather than necessarily uplift blackness. But he did so in a way, in a gesture that quite in a very elegant manner kind of does both, right? It meets you in the middle. So Kehinde Wiley, for those that don't know, a Nigerian American artist, based in Harlem, but really all around the States. He depicted Barack Obama very famously for the Smithsonian Institution's commission. His work is centered on this idea of examining Western art history by taking notable artworks, canonical artworks, replacing the figures with everyday black figures, usually people that he finds off of the street in Harlem that day dressed as they are. There is this idea that he is questioning the hierarchies, which would establish within an artwork the idea of an individual being important, right? All of the sort of gestures of your clothing, your dress, your setting, which give you a sense that this person who you're looking at in this Baroque painting or this pre-Renaissance, Northern Renaissance painting is important. He sort of turns that on his head by putting a black figure there and saying, well, you have to give this figure importance if you're following your own rules, right? But then he plays with the clothing, and by putting them in their clothing every day, he's sort of forcing someone to go a step deeper by saying you have to ignore all of the normal signifiers of wealth that would be attributed with this person and still attribute importance to this individual that I've put here. He takes this one step further with the element of sexuality, which he plays here. So the works that I've chosen here are, this is a woman bitten by a serpent. The original artwork, it was a sculpture, a marble sculpture produced by French artist Auguste Clessinguet. I don't know how to pronounce that exactly. You have to forgive me for those who are French in the chat. But Kehinde Wiley replaces the figure with a male figure. And the male figure is, sagging his pants as many sort of urban black youth might, but he's posing very erotically in the way that the female figure under the male gaze would have been made, her body contorted to sort of scintillate and titillate the viewers, right? It's the same thing happening with this male figure, but it's intentionally done. And I think it's a play on masculinity also, right, in the urban sphere. So there is a little bit of this idea of problematizing whiteness. There's a little bit idea of lifting blackness, but there's also an element of social critique, of contemporaneous social critique, right? And that, in a sense, is one of the most complete approaches to making sense of this problem of blackness. And so, which is why Kehinde Wiley's practice is so developed. But anyone, if you haven't seen this Kerry James Marshall exhibition at the Royal Academy, I implore you to go and see it, because I think what Kerry James Marshall does is a cut above in terms of this specific problem, addressing this specific problem, right? I mean, he takes blackness and says, I'm going to make sure that when I say black, you see black. So his figures are extra black, right? He takes he's still having conversations with white history, with art history in the sort of white Eurocentric canon, by taking some of their different motifs to signify direct references to those artworks. But he's painting black space, black interior space, the intimacy of black experience. He has all sorts of momentum mori, warnings to black culture. So again, there is this sort of forward-looking social criticism. But the whole practice is done still with the imperative to produce a beautiful picture that is also novel, right? And in that sense, he sort of obeys art history's terms, and still manages to tackle and change art history, reconstitute and redefine art history at the same time. I think it's a brilliant practice, and I have all the time in the world to speak about this, but I don't actually have all the time in the world for this conversation right now. So a few other highlights. So now we're talking about sort of post 2020, post Black Lives Matter. We've seen a real resurgence in the market for Black figuration. We've seen a real focus on Blackness in art, a centering of Blackness. And it's really important to give credit where credit is due, that we really have never seen anything like this, like that sort of post Black Lives Matter 2020 in the market or in the academy, this focus on Blackness. It was essential at the time, and it proves to be essential now. Of course, there were problems and there were the problematic aspects of this. And I would love to be able to discuss those in detail in the Q&A, but it's important to note that, you know, this moment happened. And then again, I'm sort of reaching back to the strands of what was done. So we can think of Linetti Adumbuachi, who I've featured here as an artist who's uplifting Blackness, who's doing that completely divorced from any of the language of Western art history. Because at this point, her predecessors like Wiley have sort of laid that down in order for her to put this down. So now this is Blackness existing in a Black space, which is aware of art history but not beholden to it. Whereas you have Toyin Oye Odutola, who's doing something closer to what Ophili and Lubena Himid are doing, where you have this sort of indigenous based but also speculative practice, which is taking from African traditions, mixing them with Western art historical traditions, and producing something completely novel, right? There's this synthesis, but it's so far removed from any of the individual source matter that we actually perceive this as something novel in art history. And then I'll end with these two slides. This is an artist named Julie Meretu, who is the highest selling African-born artist. Her auction record is just over 10, it's about $10 million, right? And her works don't have any figures. Her work isn't necessarily even Black, right? But there is a sense that she's transcended beyond the Black figure, and she signals Blackness by actually having this implicit Black presence, right? Her as the maker of the work, yes, but her work also being from the viewpoint of an individual looking at a space. And this is an idea that I got from Mary Evans from the Slade School of Art, right? And it's kind of complex, so we can go into it in the Q&A if anyone wishes. But it's this idea that she's depicting a scene from the viewpoint of an individual, and that individual is only implicitly Black, right? So there is a sort of evolution of this idea of sort of Blackness, a sense that she has triumphed above this problem which I presented. Now, I wanted to touch on this quickly to show you how African artists in the contemporary arena are circumventing this issue, returning to someone like Ella Natsui, who don't, these artists, in my view, they don't have any singular gesture in their work. Instead of putting forward a singular gesture, instead of saying social commentary, instead of attacking the canon or uplifting Blackness, they produce works which, by their very material culture, have this element of social criticism, right? And in that sense, their work isn't very Black at all. If anything, it's more Marxist than Black in certain ways, right? And again, this is a way of transcending and going beyond this problem, which I have laid down. So that concludes the lecture for now. We can go into anything that I mentioned in more detail later. But whilst we're sitting on the Q&A, I just want to make you aware of further resources that you can have access to. So this is a link to my website, newly launched, fresh off the press for you. I have a collection of a few writings there, and you have all my contact information to get in contact and speak further, if anything, as well. So yeah, with that, thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to receiving your questions. Here are the sources if anyone wants them, so you can kind of take pictures of them, but I'll leave them on the recommended reading for now. All right, thank you.
Thanks so much, Elikem. That was really informative. There's always so much to go on, and I feel like you're like just this wealth of knowledge and resources. So we do have a question, and I do encourage anybody in the chat right now, any attendees, if you would like to ask, now's the time. So we have a question from one of the attendees, Daphne. When I was in Ghana, I noticed that some of the most interesting art we encountered was in artist residencies or commercial galleries rather than museums.
Mm.
Do you think there will come a time when the Western-style museum model would serve the people in Ghana, or are there other ways right now that people are engaging with their own art history?
The question is a great question. Thank you so much for that. Yes, I do think that there will come a time where the Western style art museum becomes a mainstay in Africa, in Ghana specifically. I know that in a week's time or in 2 weeks' time, Nigeria's Museum of West African Art is opening. That's a landmark museum. The reason that I think it's controversial, problematic, and as you mentioned, the sort of the Western style, in many ways, the museum as an idea, as an institution, was created to house the objects which came from Africa, which created this problem of blackness that I'm trying to that I'm trying to put down for you. And so you have to be wary with the idea that a museum has this sort of totalitarianizing presence for laying down the idea of a national artistic culture, which doesn't allow for many dissidents, right? And the reason that that is important is because if you look at the Ghanaian art scene today, there are strands, and they run parallel to one another. Sometimes they intersect, but they are living independent lives, and they're living around these pseudo institutions, right? In lieu of any museums, as you mentioned, artist residencies have cropped up in a huge number, from artists that have made their careers abroad who have decided to sort of start institutions on the continent, and they are producing the next wave of artists. That's actually a tradition that actually is been going on for a while in Ghana with the academic tradition there. But it's not just it's also galleries, right, who have this commercial role, but are doing this, going over and above and being nurturing. Academies too. I mean, the University of Science and Technology in Kumasi, which produces, in my view, Africa's foremost art school, um, doesn't necessarily have an art history department that is so closely knit with the arts making department. But the artists themselves have taken up the role of learning art history sort of circumvent again any of these sort of infrastructure gaps. So you're going to see a lot more of this thrifty spirit of sort of going above and beyond what the institutional remit allows you to do and sort of making it work anyway. And I think what that means is when the museum does come, it's going to look different than the Western style, but it is going to be doing that same job, right? It's not going to be the World Museum, which shows you objects from all around the world, a sort of reflection of the conquest of the people. It's going to be something which actually is much more focused on showcasing what the indigenous and what the local scene has produced, and laying that down to a global audience. Yeah, whether that's going to be a success or not, I think, it's a project, it's a much larger conversation, but thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting. Also, I guess thinking about the museum as, being from this sort of westernized Eurocentric tradition, moving across somewhere else, seeing what that can evolve into. So we have another question from Seema. How would you situate the Africa is Rising narrative within the context of African art histories? So I think maybe that requires a little bit more context of what Africa is Rising is, if you don't mind.
Sure, sure. And a fabulous question. So, the Africa Rising narrative is a narrative that in many ways has been crystallized in global popular culture, I would say, for the last 2 or 3 decades. It is the idea that Africa, having faced systemic oppression, having faced sort of economic repression, having faced a lack of political self-determination, being liberated from that, will see an explosion, a sort of circumvention of the normal rules of development and progressing faster, than we've ever seen any other place in the world develop. And again, this was buttressed by the idea of the sort of Eastern Tigers, which developed, in Japan first, China second, in the sort of post-World War II, post-Cold War. And so everyone sort of assumed that if it happened there, it was going to happen in Africa, right? And in many ways, it's kind of been, um, the opposite of a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's kind of has made it more difficult for Africa to rise because of this narrative of Africa rising. Now, in the artistic realm, I would say that's certainly the case, right? I think that there is certainly an eagerness and there is an imperative to support Africa and see Africa's cultural landscape reach a sort of global level, commensurate with the talent of its individual actors. I think that's on the ground in Africa, something that you feel, but also globally, there is this real imperative. We know that we have so many talents from Africa that have gone and made a success around the world. We want to see Africa benefiting from that. We want to see Africa sort of getting the credit for that, as it were. The problem is that enthusiasm, right, and that great groundswell of sort of goodwill for Africa, is the presence of that means that when there is any sort of fledgling project that purports to be the project that will finally see Africa get its just desserts, in many ways it gets too much support before it actually can figure out its philosophical foundations and its sort of institutional remit, right? Its actual philosophy. How are we going to approach this project? And I think in many ways that's what happened with the sort of rise of Black figuration post 2020, post Black Lives Matter, is that a lot of artists, when the attention of the world came, a lot of artists didn't necessarily have a grounding in art historically, what would be a signifier of importance. And there wasn't necessarily a big amount of a critical African audience, a critical African body of, for instance, art historians that could play that role of, through criticism, constructive criticism, guiding the process of art making towards something that was seen globally as something that warranted merit, artistic merit. And so, because of that sense of Africa rising, people sort of flooded into the market and there was much more demand than supply. So these artists just looked to what was the closest thing that signified artistic merit to them that they could sort of shortcut and circumvent. And so that meant that we had a lot of work that stylistically was very, very similar to other work, but intellectually lacked much of the sort of conceptual rigor. And so, yeah, I mean, that's one of the manifestations, and at least the most recent one in the market.
Thank you. I think the next question kind of links to what you were talking about. So maybe a brief answer, and we have one or two more questions, and then I think
Okay.
we need to wrap up. So the
Okay,
next
awesome.
question is, there's so much talent in artists in Africa, especially West Africa. What separates those who have become established in the Western art world from those who are still struggling to be recognized?
Yeah, I mean, this is a fantastic question, and I think for too long it has been somewhat arbitrary. It has been a function of where you are, it's been a function of who you know, it's been a function of who represents you and who is talking about you. That determines an artist that's talented in Africa making it globally versus an artist who's in the West who's also made it, right? Um, and recently, I think that's also a function of the lack of institutions that we have. Africa wasn't necessarily in a place to, what I call, anoint its artists to go on to market sort of supremacy. This exists in the West in a very, very specific way. There's a whole sort of blueprint of art fairs, galleries, art schools, auction houses, um, which all of them act as signifiers of the quality and stature of an artist as they go up the rungs. And at every level of an artist's career, they will find these sort of things that they can have, whether it's an art prize, whether it's a residency, all of these things. Now, we don't have as many on the continent, and so that's what led to the sort of arbitrariness of this. Increasingly, as we're getting more institutions, I think that we will see less and less of a sort of arbitrariness to this. At the same time, the factors that I think have been very important here is the conceptual rigor of the artist practice, and the extent to which they produce images that strike that balance, that fundamental balance between being aesthetically imposing, striking, and novel, and being conceptually rigorous, engaging, right? And I think the artists that we have seen going to have sustainable success in the market have done this in a really beautiful and innovative way. And that's the only real rule of thumb I can give.
Great, thank you. That is a very difficult question, I feel.
Yeah.
But you are best placed to answer it. You also know very much about the art market in Africa. So next question and last one, both have to do with Julie Moretu's paintings. So the
Ah,
first one is about how do they reflect the complexity of cities or global events without directly showing people or specific places. And
Okay,
secondly,
whoever asked that question knows about Jimmy Meretu.
secondly, so the same person asked this question too. How does the use of scale and layering affect the way you experience space and time in her paintings?
Okay, so this is I'm talking to someone that is a Moretu stan and someone who probably knows Julie Moretu's practice better than me, right? But what I'll do is let me share my screen so that we can go back to the work, and then I'll take just some 2 minutes to try and talk you through the question. Right. So this work here, I think is representative of Julie Moretu's signature style, right? It has these sort of geometric lines, these abstract shapes, these elements of different sort of aesthetic traditions, from sort of uh, Renaissance drawing all the way to like Fauvism, Cubism, Constructivism with Russia. So it draws in this whole body of art history. For me, right, I mean, what her practice has been described as is reminiscent of these architectural schemes and these blueprints, right? And so in a sense, she's taking a sort of schematics of urban and industrial spaces like airports, which are meeting places for loads of communities of people. And she's trying to invoke the atmosphere, the sort of semiotic and sort of um phenomenological sort of atmosphere of these places and evoke them, but do that in the most with the most stripped back visual elements, with just lines, with just colors, with just very little forms. And the effect of that is we are forced to sort of, she forces us to consider what our perspective is in relation to this wider place. I mean, she plays with perspective very much with these lines, which reinforce these things to literally make you feel like you are an individual figure, like a small figure looking upon this sort of large space. What she's doing is sort of placing the individual within a space, which then allows them to consider the role of the individual in a wider scheme, whether that's an architectural scheme or whether that's a social scheme. Um, I mean, beyond that, I think that beyond that, I would have to leave it to you, whoever commented on this, to give us more sort of insights on the work. I think that it's really interesting because of the ways that it is considered part of the Black canon, and ways in which it doesn't identify in any way with the sort of idea of Blackness. Um, and it sort of universalizes the problem of Blackness, because in a sense, the pictures kind of force you to shrink yourself to be a figure in the work, right? To force you to adopt the viewpoint of the small individual figure. And in a sense, it's a sort of act of oppression, to kind of bring you closer to the experience of like Blackness, right? I mean, you can read into this what you will, and I don't want to be too sort of too prescriptive of what the meaning is, because I haven't met Julie and I don't know much about, I haven't read too much about her practice. But at the same time, I think that what's going on here can be identified within this problem of sort of reconciling two different traditions. But it does it in such an elegant manner that it speaks to what the future of this problem is, or the future of the addressing of this problem in the artistic realm is. Yeah.
Great. I think that was a fantastic answer and a very good place to end this lecture. Thank you so much, Elikem. He's great, amazing speaker, and I'm sure lots of you have fed back as well. So thank you so much for joining us for this evening's webinar. Our next complimentary webinar will be on John Singer Sargent with Professor Liz Prettyjohn from the University of York, taking place on the 14th of November. So do join us for that. And for more details on this and other courses from Christie's Education, find us at christies.com or reach out to us at education.christies.com. education@christies.com. We would love to have you with us. And in the meantime, thank you once again for joining us at Christie's Education this evening, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.